Hi everyone, and welcome to the event Education as if People and Planet Mattered, organized by the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative EXALT and the Global Development Studies discipline from the University of Helsinki. This is the very first on-site hybrid EXALT and GDS event after the pandemic started, and we're super happy to have you here with us, both the participants in the same room in sensory solidarity and our speakers tuning in via Zoom. My name is Saana Hokkanen, and I work as a PhD researcher here at the University of Helsinki at Global Development Studies, and I'll be facilitating today's event. On a practical level, we'll first have two talks given by two brilliant scholars and educators, Iñaki Prádanos-Garcia and Sharon Stein. After the talks, we'll have about an hour of discussion and Q&A. With Professor Stein, we're getting to listen to her talk first, which she pre-recorded for us due to the kind of uncomfortable time difference between Vancouver and Helsinki, but she will join us at the Q&A through Zoom. And I do know that there are always things that get kind of lost in discussing with someone on a screen rather than within the same room, but I think that we're also extremely lucky to get to hear, learn, and discuss across distances and create these momentary links and channels between different locations. Now, before I give center stage to our speakers, I'd like to give a bit of context and background to the topic we're sitting with and thinking with today. So the motivation for this event arises from the clear mismatch between the reality of living in times of crisis and still continue, or at least trying to continue our daily lives somewhat within the structures that are driving those very crises. Whether consciously or subconsciously, principles of growthism, economism, and Eurocentric progress prevail also in academic teaching, as do assumptions of society and nature's dualism and hierarchies such as racism, speciesism, and heteropatriarchy. Because of these, universities tend to continue to prepare students to be members of a type of society which has no future. This event is therefore about noticing and being open to what is wrong and what is hurting. And beyond that, it is about learning how to move out of that. Critical pedagogues like the late Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks have for long called for the creation and fostering of life-affirming education in comparison to schools of death. Unfortunately, one of the aspects of why higher education also needs to change is what makes the work difficult or even unachievable for some, depending on their positions. The increasing precarity of academic work and neoliberalization of universities, with the pressure of education and science themselves to be part of the productivist and economist society, do not make this work easy. Additionally, an important aspect of educating as if people and planet truly mattered is also to acknowledge and address the emotional and mental health strains that come from living in a world of wounds. Students today and in the future are facing enormously different challenges and realities, where the things they learn about in schools and universities about, for example, the climate emergency, increasing uncertainty, and loss of security are not just trivial intellectual exercises, but issues that they live through and which frame their own existence, of course, for different people and different levels. So therefore, one of the aims of this event is to create a co-learning space with the purpose to stop together in the discomfort of living in a world of hurt and crisis, all the while opening up spaces for alternative and transformational ways of learning. That is why I would also hope to foster an atmosphere of active and caring listening towards others, and a space to also talk about unfinished thoughts or insights you might even feel uncertain about, to hold this space as a shared time to learn. Okay, and now on to our speakers. So the first speaker today is Assistant Professor Sharon Stein from the University of British Columbia. Her research examines the complexities and challenges of internationalization, decolonization, and sustainability in higher education. Through her work, Professor Stein disrupts common colonial patterns of educational engagement, such as uneven and extractive relationships, simplistic solutions to complex problems, and ethnocentric imaginaries of justice, responsibility, and change. She's also a founder and a founding member of two brilliant networks, the Critical Internationalization Studies Network and the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, which is something we will be also learning about today in her talk. Followed by Sharon Stein comes our second speaker, Professor Iñaki Prádanos-Garcia, whose work on pedagogy of degrowth was actually the very inspiration for this event. Iñaki is a professor of contemporary Hispanic cultural studies at Miami University, and his research and teaching relates to environmental humanities, political ecology, critical energy studies, regenerative design, and decolonial extinction studies. He's written and published extensively on these themes, with one of the latest publications being the amazing book Postgrowth Imaginaries, which combines environmental cultural studies and post-growth economics in examining counter-hegemonic narratives and radical cultural shifts in Spain. Professor Prádanos' teaching approach is based on the aforementioned pedagogy of degrowth, which he has developed and later shared among educators and students across different universities. So thank you to both of you for being here with us, and I'd now like to kick this off with Professor Stein's talk. Thanks.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Sharon Stein. Thank you so much for having me. In my talk today, I'm going to be sharing a bit about my work, as well as the work that I do with my research collective gesturing towards decolonial futures. So I have them there listed as a co-presenter. The kind of work that I do is really not possible to do alone, and therefore I want to make sure that I make visible the work that we do collectively, even though academia encourages us to sort of be these individual geniuses. In reality, we know how many people contribute to the work that we produce, and therefore I want to name that and make it visible. The other thing I want to start with is the fact that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Stolo First Nation. And it is quite a common practice now in places like Canada, where I am, as well as other settler colonial contexts, to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of that place, and hopefully do more than just acknowledge, but rather ask what these colonial legacies ask of us, what our responsibilities are in relation to supporting the struggle of Indigenous peoples to have their lands returned to them. As well as acknowledging that what allows us to be here today through these digital machines are a lot of, in many cases, very harmful and unethical processes. For instance, mining the minerals that go into the computer that I'm speaking to you from today. And so I really want to make that visible, and it very much informs the work that I do and the work that I'm going to be talking about. So I'll start first by introducing the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. We are an interdisciplinary, international, intergenerational collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, Indigenous communities, and knowledge keepers. And we work at the interface of two questions. First is the set of questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing colonial violence, and the question of the unsustainability of our current habits of being. And that's not just ecological unsustainability, but unsustainability in many levels. The fact that this system we have created and been living in for about 500 years can't go on like this forever, and the cracks are starting to show, and that's also what I'm going to be talking about today. So in our work, we experiment with decolonial possibilities, and we say decolonial possibilities because we definitely don't claim that we are decolonized or even that we know how to do that, but we gesture, that's why the gestures in the title, toward these possibilities. And we do this in many different areas. We started out doing it in education, and that's where I primarily work, but we also have partnerships and collaborations with people working in the arts sector, working in conservation and sustainability, philanthropy, science, technology, engineering, and math, health, food systems, social innovation, and many things keep getting added to the list because there are more and more people asking for this kind of inquiry and the kind of practices that we offer. And a lot of our work is done in collaboration with Indigenous communities in Canada, Brazil, and Peru. And we're very conscious of the fact that in many cases, engagements with Indigenous people by non-Indigenous people repeats patterns of extraction and appropriation that reproduce colonial dynamics. So we try, which is not to say we always succeed, but we try to develop relationships that are grounded in trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability. And a lot of what we share is based on our own learning in terms of failures in the effort to do this, trying to learn from mistakes so that we don't keep making the same mistakes, although we know that we will keep making new ones. So a little bit more about what we actually do. We create pedagogical, artistic, and embodied experiments that try to grapple with the intellectual, but also the affective or the embodied, and the relational dimensions of social and global change. And this is based in part on critical literatures that come from decolonial, post-colonial, and ethnic studies, but also, again, as I said, on our collective learning and unlearning, including that learning from failure. So we don't try to offer any solutions or answers, but rather invitations for people to work through uncertainty, complexity, and complicity. And that is within ourselves, within the issues we address, and of course, the world itself. So this work is really not about transmitting content. We are not invested in providing information or checklists of what to do, but rather supporting people to develop containers and capacities so that they can stay with the trouble, especially when things become difficult. So we try to say that we work ourselves and also to support other people to have difficult conversations without relationships falling apart. And if you don't have a kind of container, an agreement at the beginning about the bounds of that container, about shared language and shared processes and shared concerns, then it becomes very difficult, especially when conflicts arise, to stay with it and not want to either run away from the conflict or pretend the conflict isn't there. So just go along to get along. And we want to avoid both of those traps and say, actually, when it becomes difficult, that's when the deepest learning is possible, but it's also the hardest to stay with the trouble in those moments. And we do all of this in part because we are preparing, and this is very much informed by our conversations with Indigenous community collaborators, for the end of the world as we know it. And this is not necessarily the end of everything, but the end of a modern colonial habit of being that has been unsustainable and harmful from the very beginning. But for people like me in the global north, we haven't seen that side. We've only seen the shiny side. Whereas the communities we work with in Brazil and Canada and Peru point out that this system has been like that from the beginning, and they are experiencing the shadow side of that. So they say, you know, your world can't continue anymore. And actually, we're very worried about what's going to happen when that world falls apart. So part of what we do is try to prepare people in the global north to actually prepare for that moment when the unsustainability of this system becomes harder and harder to deny, as arguably it is happening today. So I also wanted to just share this cartoon. It says, I went back to warn them, but they already knew and didn't seem to care. So this is ostensibly someone coming from the future who went back in time to warn perhaps us in this moment that things were going to get really bad and we would need to change our act. And in many ways they say, you know, I tried and they didn't seem to care. They wanted to just keep going, even though they could probably see that it was unsustainable. So this really relates to our work, because what we often say is that in education, there's this assumption that when things are harmful, when things are unsustainable, it's due to a lack of information. It's due to ignorance. And if we only gave people more information, more knowledge, then they would change their actions and the systems would change. When in reality, what we find is that sometimes we can know very well intellectually that there's a problem, and yet we still deny the implications, because it's usually the implications are asking us to change something, to give something up, often something we really enjoy and value. And many of us can know that there's a problem and yet still not be moved to make a change. So we work in the collective with this idea of denials, saying the problem is not so much ignorance, but denial, which is rooted in investment in the continuity of business as usual. So we've identified 4 particular denials. The first is denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm. Basically, the fact that our comforts, securities, and enjoyments of people like me in the global north are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation somewhere else. And in a context like Canada, that is expropriation and exploitation within Canada, especially for Indigenous peoples, but also in various places throughout the global south. The second denial is the denial of the limits of the planet. Basically, the fact that our socioeconomic systems are premised on the idea of infinite growth and infinite consumption, when in reality we have a finite planet, and that math just doesn't add up. The third denial is the denial of entanglement, our insistence on seeing ourselves as separate from one another, as individuals, rather than entangled in or interdependent within a living, wider metabolism that is biointelligent, that is the earth. And in many ways we say, like, we're connected whether we like it or not, because what I do here affects someone somewhere else, and vice versa. And then finally, denial of the magnitude and complexity of the challenges we need to face together. Basically, this tendency to look for simplistic solutions that will make us feel good and look good, and that may address some of the symptoms of the problems we want to address, but rarely can address the root causes of our complex collective predicament that we find ourselves in. And so we say, if the problem is denial, and not ignorance, then we need a very different kind of education than the one that we're used to. And that's what we're sort of working with in the collective. So what is this complex collective predicament that we find ourselves in now? We summarize this in 5 different elements of the current socio-historical context. So the first is the fact that we're facing a cacophony of different perspectives. There is information overload, much of it misinformation, but even information that is not necessarily misinformation, it's basically impossible to process all of the information we receive, especially now that we're constantly connected to the internet and information comes from so many sources, and we don't have, in many ways, the processing power to work through that and discern what is important, what we need to do, and what is our role in all of this. So this really leads to the fact that there's no stable epistemic and moral authorities. There's a fragmentation. Places like the university that used to be understood as hegemonic sites of knowledge are now being questioned. And this also leads people to kind of choose their own corners in this fight and leads to a lot of polarization as well. So there's really not possible to have consensus on what indicates the common good. And there's something possible there because having a hegemonic knowledge source is not necessarily a good thing, but we also see that we have swung in the other direction. Now it's a free-for-all, and people tend to just pick what knowledge is convenient for them. So we have this cacophony of different perspectives that we're grappling with. The second piece is that we are oversaturated with unprocessed emotions, especially because in Western societies, we are taught to focus on the intellect and we ignore the body. We ignore what the body's telling us. We ignore the information we could actually be getting from the body to figure out what we need to do to process things that are holding us inside and holding us back from actually facing these difficult truths. So we lack resilience and we lack both individual and collective capacity to basically keep it together. We are seeking comfort, security, and control, and given the state of the world, that's really not possible. And yet, because we don't know how to process those desires and compost them to be something else, we tend to get stuck in these affective loops that are not necessarily good for us or for other people or for our capacity to face the shit, basically, that we will need to face if we want to have a different kind of world. So the third piece is that we are facing increased volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and people have called this VUCA. And not only are we facing these different things, but we don't have practices and processes for holding all of that. We desperately want to restore stability, certainty, simplistic solutions, and clear answers. And this is part of what leads, for instance, people to elect strong leaders who might have very harmful policies and processes, but because we're looking for someone to manage this and promise us that actually we can have certainty, we can have simplistic solutions, we go in very harmful directions in search of that, instead of, again, figuring out how we can hold the fact that the world is volatile, uncertain, and complex, and it's not going to get any less so anytime soon. The fourth piece is that we are really incentivized and rewarded in our institutions, through social media, to be hedonistic, narcissistic, and hyper-individualistic. And this is for various reasons. And some of them can be actually from recognizing how bad things are, how difficult it is, and saying, I just don't think I can do it, and there's no way of changing it, so I'm just going to enjoy my life. That would be one way that people go toward that direction. So we really look for consumption, and not just consumption of things, but also consumption of knowledge, consumption of relationships, as a mode of appeasing our desire for that certainty and that comfort and security. And we want to maintain our presumed entitlement to autonomy, to arbitration, and to authority. And so we go in that individualistic direction, even though that's probably leading us away from responsibility and from the possibility of different kinds of relationships. So all of this kind of points to the fact that the education we have, that we receive in Western institutions, including universities like mine, really does not prepare us to be grown-ups in the kind of world we're facing. And if that's the case, what kind of education could do that? And that is a really big point of inquiry for the collective. So one thing I want to kind of bring us to next is the fact that those are the systemic conditions where we find ourselves. So how does this feel for us as individuals? And I already gestured a bit toward that. But again, there's this desire for certainty, familiarity, safety, and convenience. There's discomfort with complicity, ambiguity, paradoxes, and contradictions. There's fear about the uncertainty that we're facing. We're worried about humiliation, worthlessness, irrelevance. And these are all loops that we get stuck in because of the systems that we're in, because it tells us we have to constantly prove our worth. And of course, there's also this, again, desire for moral authority, autonomy, and arbitration. So we are not well equipped to face and navigate VUCA as a whole. It's not true for everybody, but as a whole, we are not ready for that. And what I want to share is one way of approaching that challenge of how do we prepare ourselves and other people. So one of the ways we've conceptualized this is thinking about layering reality and seeing that in any given context, in any given moment, there are a multitude of things informing that context. And each person brings their own layers to come together and have a very complicated layering of reality that in many cases I find younger people are already more aware of. They see the complexity. In many ways, you can think of it as a computer browser with many tabs open. Those are all the layers that we're seeing. It's not just one-dimensional when we look at a conflict or a context. We see the many pieces that are informing that. And hopefully developing the discernment to know what our responsibility is in relation to that context. So just to kind of give this a more concrete example, I have a colleague who works in food systems education. And one of the things he does in his courses is invite students to think about what they're thinking about when they enter into a restaurant. And the usual answers before this work is done is, I'm thinking about probably what I'm going to order from the restaurant. But what his pedagogy does is try to invite them to see the many different layers that are making up this restaurant. So questions about where does the food come from? Is it sourced sustainably? On whose land is it grown? How are those people paid? How much is the staff paid? Is the restaurant contributing to gentrification of a neighborhood? How is it that they have the financial situation to be able to go to that restaurant and other people don't? So sometimes students say, okay, now that I see all these layers, it's very hard for me to enjoy a restaurant. And that's not really the point. But the point is, in any given context, there are multiple things happening and multiple accountabilities that we're often invisibilizing if we don't do this kind of layering work and this kind of discernment work about what that context is asking of us. So I'm going to now shift to thinking about how we can approach universities and education in universities with this layering in mind. And we have a few specific layers that we like to invite people to think with and through and feel through as well, so that they can start to see how reality and its complexity is there, yes, but it's also something that we can work with. We don't have to run away from it. We don't have to repress it. So in my context, there's a lot of conversation these days about decolonization of the university, particularly in relation to responsibilities to Indigenous peoples and their lands. So we have a lot of statements from universities like mine that essentially boil down to the university is committed to anti-racism and decolonization. And that's sort of the official statement. And then you see everyone here in the university and their possible responses. And the first layer to pay attention to is what we call polycymic awareness, essentially the idea that language and words have multiple meanings. There's not just a single, straightforward, literal description of reality. Just because the university says it's committed doesn't mean that its actions actually bear this out. So that's the first layer to pay attention to. Words don't always mean what we think they mean because people are interpreting them in very different ways. Now, this is not just about the university having different interpretations, but also the people within the university. And this is a question of heteroglossia, the fact that there will be multiple interpretations, ideas, and feelings within a single group. So you can see this sort of range of responses that I've mapped from a university like mine. And we go all the way from people reproducing racist ideas, for instance, the person on the left saying, including these racialized people in the university is threatening the excellence of our institution, therefore assuming that equity is incompatible with excellence. And then we have someone who's saying, okay, I want equality, but I feel like it's the thought police. They keep shoving it down our throats. Then the people who say, okay, well, I don't really want to get involved with this. It feels very political. I just want to do my work. Then some people saying, okay, I'm going to do this tokenistic move. Maybe if I put some Indigenous authors on my syllabus, then they'll leave me alone and this can all be done. Then there's the person who takes the statement from the university very seriously and says, I'm really glad the university is finally taking this important stance. Then the person who says, okay, I know this statement is just PR, it's just public relations, they're just worried about their brand, but I'm going to use this statement to try and push for actual change. Then the person who says, you know what, I'm not standing for this. We know these words mean nothing, and we need to demand meaningful change now. I'm going to, occupy the office of the president, for instance. And then the person who says, you know what, I'm not going to bother engaging at all because what's the point? Until they give us our land back, I'm not going to be a part of this conversation. So you can see that within one institution, and this is just a sampling of responses, there are many different responses to a single statement from the university. But we can also see that even within a single person, there's multiple responses. So this we call heteroglossia too. So it's the layering within a single person. So this is the person who said, maybe if I just put some different people on my syllabus, they'll leave me alone. But they have other thoughts as well. Like, okay, maybe I would talk about this, but I don't want to because I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. And then this curiosity about, well, why is this so important all of a sudden? I don't see where this is coming from. Concerns about academic freedom. Worry that this move won't be enough to keep them from getting critiqued, and also thinking, I'm not Indigenous, why would they expect me to teach Indigenous issues? So those are the varied thoughts of one person. And then there's also the varied affective responses, this feeling of shame about the fact that they're complicit in colonization, or guilt, anxiety about doing the wrong thing, and fear that if they don't do the right thing, then they're going to be somehow punished for it. So another layer is also the fact that in many cases we look at a context and we just see this particular moment in time. And that's called synchronic thinking. And what we want to encourage people to do is develop diachronic thinking. So that is the ability to trace where a statement like the university statement is actually coming from and where it's going. So for instance, thinking about the fact that colonization has been going on in Canada for several hundred years, this statement is a product not only of the fact that that colonization is ongoing, but also all of the resistance and challenges to it that have brought the university to a place where they realize they have to make a statement about this. But also thinking about, where is this statement going? In what direction is this moving? And people might have different interpretations of that, but just the intention to think about situating ourselves in a particular moment in time and then zooming out and seeing where we are in a longer continuum. And of course, this happens on a collective level with a statement like this, but also in terms of individuals and thinking about how they came to understand this statement and where their own response came from and where that response is also leading. So if you have a racist response to that statement, thinking about the systemic racism that has informed and socialized you, and also the impacts of that on other people. Another layer we have is called ontosympathy, and this is the idea that we are able to actually feel and sense into not just the pain of others, but all emotions, but in particular pain, because this is one we tend to deny, especially those of us who are complicit in creating a lot of systemic pain. And this is not an easy task to do, and I would never say that someone like me is ever able to actually feel into the same way that an Indigenous person in Canada feels, but I have a sense of the depth of the pain that they're experiencing that I have caused, and I'm not numbing myself to it, which is what we tend to do so that we continue enjoying the things that colonialism gives us and therefore reproduce those denials that I was talking about earlier. And to be able to do this is not just an intellectual exercise. The first few layers that I looked at can be addressed in many ways in intellectual ways, but for this one, it really has to be affective and embodied. We need to learn to unnumb ourselves to not just the pain, but to everything, so that we can ask, again, what our responsibility is in relation to that. And that's where these last few layers come in. And these are called diffractive engagements. So the first one is, in general, this capacity to zoom out or step back from oneself and one's responses in order to hold space for our own internal layers of complexity. So how I do all of this other layering work and how I, for instance, respond to this statement is coming from my own complexity, and I could have a range of responses within me. I don't just have one coherent response. And thinking about, again, where are those responses coming from? Where are they going to? Are they generative? And if not, how might I reorient so that I can actually show up differently in order to face this complexity? And the second layer of diffractive engagement is the capacity to zoom out and step back from our own social historical context. So not just individual context, but collective context, in order to hold space for these layers of complexity that have to do with where we are in a longer continuum of time, where we are geographically, what our positionality is, and that is in relation to our race, our class, our gender, as well as our generation, because we're seeing a lot of these generational divides as well. So can we zoom out, not step away from, but step back from these systems that have socialized us in order to see how they're actually operating, and then how we might interrupt them if they are harmful, and recalibrate so that we can bring ourselves to more generative and accountable states, so that we can move collective ways of thinking, feeling, and relating into more generative and accountable states collectively, not just individually, but as a whole. And that, again, would be a question of our responsibility as people who are benefiting from these systemic harms. So I know this can be kind of overwhelming if we think about all of the social and ecological crises that we're facing. And I think it's really important to do this kind of layering, and that's what we invite in the collective, so that we can have not a bird's eye view, not a universal or objective view, but a more layered understanding of how we got here and what direction we're heading in. And if we don't like that direction, how might we shift things? Now, this can be overwhelming. So we also say that one question you can always ask yourself when engaging in this work is, in any given context, what is the next most responsible small thing I can do in order to interrupt harm and move towards more generative, responsible, mature directions? And in any context, this question is quite useful. And it feels small scale, but in many ways, what we can do as individuals is small. But if we all do our part, then something else can become possible, especially if we can figure out how to do it in a wider scale and with other people in relational ways. So with all that being said, we recognize that this work is extremely difficult. It is intellectually taxing. It is challenging for the body, especially if we have not done a lot of work to kind of familiarize ourselves with our embodied responses and asking what they might mean. And therefore, we know that there will be failure involved in trying to relate to social and ecological crises differently. So based on our own failures in the collective, we have developed a kind of peer review system in a way. But anyone can ask these questions of themselves in relation to the general work that they're doing or a specific project. And we try to draw attention to the usual patterns that tend to happen when we're trying to interrupt colonial relations, because we are swimming against the tide. We're swimming against a lifetime of socialization that is constantly being reinforced, and therefore we are bound to make mistakes. And it's almost impossible not to reproduce at least some colonial patterns in our institutions as we find them. So I'll just share some of these questions here. And so the first one is, to what extent are you reproducing what you critique? And this is a difficult one, because often once we see a problem and we name that problem, we distance ourselves from that problem or disidentify and say, I'm a settler in settler colonial context of Canada, and I see that this is a problem, and I name that it's a problem, and I even devote my work to working against that problem. And we want to then feel like we're we are absolved of that, or that we're not complicit anymore just because we name the problem. But in reality, we're reproducing it all the time. So the second question would be, to what extent are you avoiding looking at your own complicities and denials, and at whose expense? And this is, of course, related to the first. It's much more easy to point the finger outward than to look inward and see how we are also part of the problem, even as we might also be trying to interrupt and address it. The third piece is, what are you actually doing this for? What are your motivations? And we're always kind of suspicious, right? We're not reliable narrators of our own experience and our own intentions, because we want to usually tell a good story about what we're doing. And again, in many cases, there are good things there, but in some cases, there's also harmful colonial patterns that are being reproduced, often at the same time. So who are we accountable to? What's our theory of change? And what are we trying to move in the world with our work? Relatedly, who is this work really about? Is it just about me and making me feel better? Or is it about my responsibility to something beyond myself? Who is benefiting the most from this work? Is it just me and my career, or is it actually enabling other things to move? Am I doing it in service, or am I doing it in service to others, or am I doing it in service just to myself? Then to what extent are you aware of how you're being read by communities of high intensity struggle? Who in these communities might roll their eyes at what you're doing? And this is one I sit with a lot when I'm in my university meetings and thinking about some of the things that I do say, because I know they can move things in my context, but I also know at the same time that if the communities I work with heard some of this, they would really roll their eyes, or at least be laughing at me. And I always have to balance, being informed by what I think they would be thinking, and then also knowing that the general work of moving our institutions from where they are stuck requires us to meet them where they're at. So sometimes I have to say things in ways that I really would prefer not to, but I know they're going to resonate in that context. So I say, I'm going to do this for now, and then I'm going to keep pushing so that we get to a place where maybe the community wouldn't be rolling their eyes, but we're not there yet. And better for me to be doing this work than to make the communities do that labor. Okay, so then who is your imagined audience? What do you expect from this audience? What compromises have you had to make in order for this work to be intelligible and relatable to this audience? And to what extent can these compromises compromise the work itself? And that relates to what I was just saying when I go into these meetings and I'm speaking to administrators, for instance, and I know that I've had to bracket certain things or certain complexities, certain critiques, because it's too much too soon. And if I push too much too soon, then I get a huge pushback and it shuts down the conversation. But then I also know that when I compromise so that they can hear, there are things I'm leaving out, and I'm accountable to the things that I'm leaving out, and I need to be able to come back to them and do it in ways that don't compromise the integrity of the work or my own integrity. Then how wide is the gap between where you think you're at and where you're actually at? And this is a big one, because often for those of us engaged in this work, we think we're further along than we really are. In many cases, we're just scratching the surface of this, but we feel like we've done so much work that we're almost there. And that's always a red flag. When you feel like you're already there or you're already doing it, that's when you should pause and say, okay, what am I missing? Because the reality is this is lifelong work. It's not something that's done in a day, in a month, in a year, or even years. So how do we maintain some sense of reality about like where we're at versus where we want to be? And how would we be able to see where we're actually at? And this is a question to ask, like that's why we ask, who would be able to help you realize that? Because it's not something we would necessarily be able to see ourselves. We need to have people around us who we authorize to tell us, here's where you're kind of not getting it. And also then listening to them when they say that and not just becoming defensive. And then relatedly, to what extent can you respond with humility, honesty, humor, and self-reflexivity when your work or self-image are challenged? So when that person, especially someone from a community engaged in high intensity struggles, like the indigenous communities we work with in Brazil, Peru, and Canada, say that we're getting something wrong or we're going in a bad direction, how do we respond in a way that is actually appreciative of the labor of them interrupting our colonial patterns and naming it, even though they know it's a risk for them because it could risk the relationship, we could get defensive, and we could blame the messenger. So as you can see, there's a lot of work to be done. And what we are trying to do in the collective is develop tools and practices and frameworks that can support people to actually stay with this. And we say that it's probably only going to get more difficult, so the time to start preparing is now. Now, we also know that not everyone is going to be interested in this invitation, and that's why we do frame it as an invitation. Take from this what is useful, leave what is not. I know that for some people it's exactly what they're looking for, and for other people it's way too much. And so we are not a normative, we don't make normative statements about we must do this or you should do this, but we rather say, if we want a possibility of surviving and living together differently on this planet, then we need to roll up our sleeves and do the work of composting centuries of colonial harm that we ourselves in many ways embody. And that is, again, lifelong work. So how do we get ready for that marathon instead of thinking that it's a sprint? So that's all I'm going to share with you today. I hope it wasn't too much. I'm really happy and excited to answer your questions in the live session. Bye-bye.
Can you see the PowerPoint? Yes.
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so very interesting. And as you will see, this will be related as well in some different ways. And thank you, Saana, for putting this together. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. So my talk today is going to address why I believe that most of our current educational and academic tendencies are disempowering and defuturing, and why we need to radically change the way we teach and the way we research if we want to create the conditions of possibility for a future that is socially desirable and environmentally viable. I believe that any meaningful critical pedagogy and any meaningful research agenda today needs to engage in what Rob Nixon calls the greatest crisis of our time, the environmental crisis and the inequality crisis. I believe that both crises go hand in hand and are related to the socio-ecological dysfunctions of our dominant economic culture. For that reason, my work combines ecological economics, political ecology, energy humanities, and cultural studies to understand the needed changes in teaching and research to stimulate new, radically different economic cultures. A few years ago, I started working on two interrelated projects intended to challenge the dominant imaginary of economic growth in the academia, in higher education. One is what I call the pedagogy of degrowth, and the other is related with my book, Postgrowth Imaginaries. Today, I will talk mostly about the first one, the pedagogy of degrowth. So, as we know, transforming education is crucial to generate the society able to deal with the complex socio-ecological challenges of our time. We are immersed in a socially and environmentally insane globalizing system that promotes a linear conception of progress based on ruthless competition, overconsumption, energy depletion, and debt-driven economic growth in the context of a limited biosphere, and by so doing generates the present socio-ecological crisis. The ongoing social and ecological crises are interconnected, since when our economic system grows, it depletes the environment, and when it doesn't grow, it becomes socially unsustainable. So the problem arises from a logic that exploits both humans and non-humans as mere economic resources to trigger constant economic growth in the context of a limited biosphere, which is a biophysical impossibility. So if the economy grows 3% a year, in a few more than 2 decades, we double the size of the global economy, right? And the global economy is already depleting the planet very quickly. So the faster the global economy grows, the faster the ecological system that support life on Earth collapse. Actually, the global economy cannot grow much more given the ecological situation, but has to reduce its size significantly. According to this article, it has to reduce its size by at least 1/3. But this article is 10 years old. Now we are using the ecological capacity of 1.75 Earths, not 1.5 like 10 years ago. So probably we had to reduce the metabolism of the economy much more. So actually, we are globalizing a model that is impossible to universalize, because if all the regions in the planet are to consume the amount of energy and materials that we use in the so-called developed countries, we would need from 4 to 6 planets. So developed countries are energetic vampires. They are basically models not to follow. You are probably familiar by now with the term Anthropocene, right? But I prefer Jason Moore and others' Capitalocene because the biogeophysical changes that we are experimenting are not the result of an abstract and differentiating humanity, but of a historically specific way of organizing the relation between humans and the rest of nature, which is capitalism and colonialism. And probably you are also familiar with the planetary boundaries concept, right? So some scientists said that we have 9 planetary boundaries that we shouldn't transgress if we want to not to be in high risk of ecological collapse. And apparently we just transgress at least 3 or 4. There are different models. So these warnings are not new. Major scientific warnings concerning the detrimental environmental impacts of capitalist petromodernity had been many, at least since 1960s, when some scientists reported that economic growth was going to face ecological limitations in the near future. Well, the future is now. But there are any problems with these framings, like the planetary boundaries, the Anthropocene? Of course, there are many problems. They don't mention the real problem, which is the deadly logic of constant growth in a finite planet. None of these framings name and target the real roots of the problem. They say nothing about colonial history, power asymmetries, patriarchal relations. They focus on managerial and technological solutions and grossly ignore the radical cultural and social transformations that the current situation requires. They do not understand that the problem is not technological, it's not a tool, it's the logic, it's a cultural problem, it's a social problem. So we need social innovation, not technological innovation. They do not acknowledge the differential responsibilities and vulnerabilities in these geophysical transformations, right? So there are many problems. What is true is that the expansion of our economic metabolism is necrotic because it is killing life on Earth. Our dominant economic culture is an ideology of extinction that triggers a process of biological annihilation. As such, it's a defuturing cultural paradigm. We need to change that paradigm, and that entails changing the socio-ecological debates. All the socio-environmental debates need decolonial, ecofeminist, and pluriversal perspectives, not just scientific perspectives from the Western universities. We need political ecology, understanding that environmental issues are always issues of power, and so on and so forth. So in any case, there is a correlation, a clear correlation between the expansion of the economic metabolism, what is called globalization, and the mass extinction on life on Earth. And this is clear, right? For example, a recent article in Nature found out that human-made things now overweight all biomass on Earth. In other words, we are transforming life into infrastructure more and more rapidly, right? Okay, so the good news is that economic growth per se may not even be socially desirable. We know that it's environmentally unviable, but may not even be socially desirable after all. A proliferation of research in social sciences consistently shows that in rich countries, more economic growth does very little or nothing at all to enhance social well-being. However, reducing inequality is the most effective way to resolve all kinds of social problems, from violence and criminality to obesity and mental illness. Comparative studies in epidemiology found that more equal societies do much better in all the mentioned issues than more unequal ones, independently of their GDP. Therefore, the focus of our societies should be to reduce inequality, not to grow the GDP for its own sake. Unfortunately, most of the economic growth of the last 4 decades was accumulated in few hands, resulting in a massive global increase in inequality. In 2013, the world's 85 richest people, a group small enough to fit into a double-decker bus, in the unlikely event that they would be inclined to take a bus, have a net worth equal to that of 50% of the planet's population. the 3.5 billion poorest people. Well, this number is now down to 9. 9 people has more wealth than half of the human population. And with the pandemic, this got worse. So in the last 2 years, the 9 or 10 richest people doubled their fortunes. But this inequality is not just a few people accumulating the existing resources, but also depleting the sources of wealth, of future regeneration. So the richest 10%, for example, are responsible for almost half of the total lifestyle consumption emissions, while the poorest 50% are only responsible for 10%. So basically, it's not just an accumulation of the existing wealth, but also the depletion of the sources of future wealth. So inequality is problematic in many, many different ways. So then a really meaningful and relevant research and teaching agenda in the current context of unacceptable social inequality and ecological collapse must question the dominant imaginary of economic growth that is causing both inequality and ecological decline. Okay. So if we consider everything I mentioned so far and put it together and then apply it to our classrooms or any educational setting, we will get to an obvious conclusion. It is illogical or even suicidal to educate our students to contribute to economic growth and to compete in the global economy, since that model of neoliberal globalization is deleterious in a double way, symbolically and biophysically, for it is destroying both our political imagination as well as the possibility for our biophysical survival. So we need instead, we all should be teaching instead how to create a new system based on a socially desirable and environmentally viable degrowth. That's a pedagogy of degrowth needs to be envisioned, articulated, and applied across the curriculum of academic institutions. Degrowth is an umbrella term that, although has been around for a while, entered the international academic debate in 2008. Although the complexity of the debate within the degrowth movement is significant, most of its supporters would agree that degrowth challenges the commonplace idea that economic growth should be the main motivation of societies. The goal of societies should be instead the well-being of communities operating within ecological limits and favoring social justice. But for that society to emerge, it is crucial to decolonize the dominant imaginary of economic growth that it is ingrained in consumerist and capitalist cultures. This is not an easy task, but education must play an important role for that project to be successful. So far, universities have been instrumental in promoting business as usual and exploring economic growth. Today, we are much more efficient at depleting the earth than we were a few decades ago. So the problem is not the tool, it's not the technology, but the logic. The solution is not to do better or more efficiently the insane things that we are already doing, but to do things in radically different ways. The question remains, is it really smart to educate people to technologically and theoretically refine a system that operates by undermining the conditions of possibility for our biophysical survival? Is it smart to make a extractive system smarter, more sophisticated, and more efficient? Well, most classroom practices, curriculum content, and departmental programs across academic disciplines are designed as if the answer to these questions would be yes. More and more university administrators are stating that universities should prepare students to successfully compete in the global economy. However, according to my pedagogy of degrowth, it doesn't make sense for students to become slaves of our own tool, the economic system, especially when that system is destroying the ecosystems that support life on Earth. Higher education should not be a factory for economic growth, but the place where people are trained to question if that system is socially desirable and ecologically sound, and if not, to envision and create new systems. So I talk a little bit about this in the introduction of Postgrowth Imaginaries, this book. And basically claim that the problem is the ongoing globalization of an economic system addicted to constant growth, which disrupts the ecological planetary systems that support life on Earth while failing to fulfill its social promises. And both techno-optimism and catastrophism are counterproductive for several reasons to solve these problems. So what I think is that to be socially desirable, the emerging post-growth economic cultures that will come needs to be decolonial, ecofeminist, post-capitalist, and post-humanist all at the same time. If we overlook one of these four pillars, we will have post-growth economic cultures because it's biophysically impossible not to in the near future, but they may be socially undesirable. So what we need to work now is in making that transition socially desirable, basically. And that is where the pedagogy of degrowth plays a role. So in the last 10 years, I designed a number of courses in environmental humanities and cultural studies that has a few aspects that I call the pedagogy of degrowth. I will briefly share three aspects of my teaching method. The first one is a strategy that I call unlearning by reverse critical pedagogy. The second is a critique of existing teaching materials and contents within the traditional disciplines. And the third is the incorporation of indigenous pedagogies from the Andean region. Unlike dominant pedagogies, pedagogical paradigms, my teaching method doesn't prioritize content itself, but rather focuses on students' imagination and empowerment, community building, and deep and slow reflexivity. I found that exploring radical and alternative solutions rather than merely providing information about existing problems is the most effective way to avoid paralyzing fear, which according to recent studies triggers conservative thinking, and to promote activism. So actually, when students explore solutions is when they get to really understand the complexity of the problems. So I will elaborate very briefly on the three aspects one by one, although all of them are to be integrally understood as constituting the emerging pedagogy of degrowth that I am envisioning and practicing. So the first aspect would be the unlearning by reverse critical pedagogy, and all the activities under this umbrella term will have the goal to make students aware that they don't know what they don't know, and that many common places that they think they know are nothing but learned ignorance. For instance, I ask students if they want the GDP to grow and if they consider that to be a good thing and why. I ask them to define GDP, which usually they cannot. Students answer all kinds of common places, assuming that GDP growth is always good. Then I give them many examples of GDP growth that results on higher criminality rates and health problems, huge increase in inequality, environmental degradation, and even a loss of purchasing power by the majority of the local population. I also draw a clean river and a little town down the river. I explain that people from that town filter and use the water directly from the river. They also enjoy socializing and exercising by the river. The clean river doesn't affect the GDP at all, but it is obviously beneficial for the local community and also for the non-human community. If a factory starts polluting the river, several monetary transactions will follow, and as a result, the GDP will grow. For example, the local people will have to buy water in the grocery store. They will not be able to use the river for socializing, playing, or exercising, so they will have to pay for a rec center membership or going to the mall for socializing. The polluted environment can also affect the health of the locals, so they will have to pay for medicines and hospital bills, and so on. All this will contribute to the growth of the GDP. Why, I ask students, the goal of our society is GDP growth and not the well-being of communities and ecosystems? As homework, students answer these questions in brief essays. The second aspect of my pedagogy, a pedagogical critique of existing teaching materials and contents within the traditional discipline. So we as a class use critical discourse analysis to deconstruct the unquestioned assumptions, bias, blind spots of some popular textbooks and teaching materials available for our course, whatever the course may be. So basically, the idea is that textbooks should never be considered a source of information to be memorized, but as perpetuators of the dominant imaginary to be exposed and criticized. So let me give you a specific example that we had done in a classroom. I designed 5 parameters related to ecological intelligence and applied them to 3 of the more popular textbooks used in North American universities to teach the lower levels of the Spanish language. These parameters analyze the degree in which the textbooks contribute or not to normalize and disseminate unsustainable values. The first is that it promotes a culture based on superfluous and irresponsible consumerism. 2, it perpetuates unsustainable and unhealthy eating habits. 3, it normalizes the inefficient and unnecessary use of energy. 4, it perpetuates a culture of disposability. And 5th, it presents sustainability issues in superfluous and misleading ways, like recycle, right? So the results in the table show that all the books are failing miserably in almost all the criteria and thus are promoting anti-ecological values. So then the students do the same in other books, right? And these kind of activities can be modified to match virtually any course. The professor can either give the parameters to the students, so they apply them to books in groups, or even better, ask the students to establish their own parameters as a class, which is an opportunity to work on consensus building. For example, in a course on ecofeminism that I teach, I ask the students to, as a class, we have the criteria for ecofeminist, 5 ecofeminist parameters that we all agree. And then each student has to select a book, a textbook that they use during the university years. Could be any topic, economics, biology, psychology, whatever. And then they have to apply the parameters, and then they will have mini presentations in which they will show the parameters to the classroom, right? So also we criticize the root metaphors in textbooks that perpetuate the dominant imaginary. For example, we use a book about cultural history in Spain and then analyze the root metaphors. For example, the idea of the Spanish economic miracle, right? This idea that economic growth, rapid economic growth is a miracle. And then we criticize this idea because there is nothing miraculous about rapid economic growth. During these same years, the average Spanish salary lost 4% of its purchasing power, inequality and energy consumption increased dramatically, and the Spanish territory suffered unprecedented environmental depletion. So there is nothing to celebrate here, right? We all know that the secret and the great accomplishment of capitalist civilization had been not to pay its bills. So there is nothing miraculous about economic growth. By the way, this book is really good. Other root metaphor that is repeated in cultural history is this idea of to take the train of modernity. We had all the regions have to take the train of modernity. Again, we analyze this root metaphor and it's very problematic once you see what that entails, because this metaphor indicates an understanding of modernity as linear. There is a teleological path toward a consumerist and competitive way of organizing social relations. So this expression, to take the train of modernity, ignores that this modernity is addicted to growth and its expansion is actually killing life on Earth. This expression also lacks an understanding of the mutual constitution of modernity and coloniality. This approach is obviously ethnocentric, colonial, extractive, and so on and so forth. But the authors of these books, which are very educated professors, are trained not to notice these things that they are perpetuating, because they are trained not to notice these things, basically. So, but a simple question, what would happen if all people on Earth take the train of modernity? Right? We will need from 4 to 6 planets. So cannot be universalized. So the last aspect of my pedagogy is the incorporation of activities inspired by indigenous pedagogies from the Andes, what is called communitarian pedagogy. A communitarian pedagogy recognizes that everything, human and non-human, is interconnected and equally important for the vitality of the community. Learning should not be disconnected from the emotional and biophysical realities of the biotic community. A communitarian pedagogy should include everybody and be circular and cyclical. Everybody teaches and everybody learns. Everyone will assume all the roles at some point, and all actors are co-responsible for the learning outcome of the whole community. So I will put a few examples. So what I do is in all my classrooms, I include activities designed to establish a learning community of active listeners to promote cooperative learning rather than individualistic or competitive learning, which usually is the default in Western universities, to democratize the content and to enhance creativity to think beyond the dominant imaginary. For example, active listening versus toxic activism. Active listening is a very important and overlooked skill in academia, right? We talk about rhetoric, speech. We tell students how to put their bullshit on others, right? But not to listen. So we have to create the space for active listening. Listen to learn, not to respond, not to win, not to impress, not to show off, but to learn. And that entails to be completely present where you are, right? This entails to attune to the pace and flow of the classroom, meaning you have to observe how other people are acting and reacting. You have to observe if some people are not participating in the conversation before you talk again, right? And think why that person is not talking. Just to give you an example on how I incorporate this active listening framework in the class, in the first time that I taught the ecofeminist class, I have some students that they were pro-life. So, and I have another group of the students that they were very into ecofeminism. So, but they were very militant and they were kind of alienating the pro-life student in a way that the pro-life student stopped talking. They got alienated and never participated anymore. They just closed themselves to learning. So this kind of activism is not productive because nobody's learning, right? One group is perpetuating and putting their thing on others, but the other group is not listening, right? So that is not what I wanted. So the next time that I taught the same class, I already talk explicitly in the classroom about active listening and toxic activism, and then I make some activities to create that environment. Basically, I started talking about how ecofeminism is basically designing cultures that put life at the center. Then the pro-life students open their eyes and say, oh, this resonates with me. Oh, very good. So let's see. So when we talk, I said that we shouldn't agree or disagree with anything. What we should think is resonances. What resonates with you and what doesn't resonate with you and why. So all the students have the possibility, I gave them posits from green colors and red colors, and all students in an anonymous way has to write in the green posit something that resonates with them about ecofeminisms, and in the red one something that do not resonate with them. Then we all put that in the walls, and then all the students will collect a couple of them randomly and reflect on them. Then we will start identifying patterns in those posits, and then we will start talking about we change the discourse. So we say, okay, what resonates with us and why, and what doesn't resonate with us and why. So then at this moment, they were not enemies. Nobody was trying to win anything. So we were a learning community. And it's when the opportunity for an open, respectful, honest, and challenging conversation starts. And it's when then we could talk about the difference between ecofeminist and pro-life approaches to life, and how we know that the ecofeminist approach to life is more effective to protect life, actually, for different reasons. But then the pro-life people were open to discuss that and to learn from that, and to they were not threatened, right? So another thing is collaborative learning. I spent a lot of time doing activities that make the class a collaborative learning environment. For example, every student will have to facilitate the discussion at some point. Then what I call collective readings. I give the students like a book of essays. Nobody will have to read the whole book, but every student will be responsible for one chapter. Then that person will give the whole class the tips that that person considers more relevant. So what do you think that everybody should know about your chapter? So they will have to digest that for the classroom. The important thing about this activity is if one person doesn't do their part, the whole class suffers, right? So they understand that they are not individual learners, but part of a learning community. Also, using the collective intelligence to answer questions. There are questions, the questions, they are not coming always to me. I just said, okay, we have mechanisms for the intelligence of the whole class to answer this question. And usually the answer of the collective intelligence is much better than my answer would be. Then the idea of democratizing the content. We have to have some blank spaces in all the syllabi, right? Otherwise, we are just putting our bias there, which we are already. But just having some blank spaces and allowing the students to identify the topics that are relevant within what we are discussing, what is missing, what they want to learn more, why. So this is something very important. Also, creativity has to go beyond the dominant imaginary. Basically, we have to change the stories we live by. So giving students the opportunity to start thinking about changing the story in a proactive way. For example, we do critical fictional essays in which the students will have to write a short story, which is take place in an ecofeminist city. So they have to think about urban feminism, what kind of legal system, educational system, daily interactions will have an ecofeminist city, right? But you have to make room also for diverse ways of feeling, thinking, processing, and creating. So if somebody is not logocentric and doesn't want to create an essay like writing, okay, just do a performance, do a video, do a song, whatever way of expression really match your way of seeing things. And then envisioning desirable post-growth imaginaries, right? These activities has to envision a different system. Some considerations about the learning environment. We have to build trust in the classroom. If you don't trust your students, you make them untrustworthy by default. So we shouldn't do that. You should trust your students, right? Understanding bias. For example, if you want your students to evaluate themselves, tell them that minorities, for example, evaluate themselves, give themselves a less grade that a privileged person would, right? And so on. So tell them so they account for that. Also, we have bodies, right? So students have to be moving. You have to be moving. You only learn when you are ready to learn, and that's very important. You cannot force the journey of anybody. If you do, that is counterproductive. You cannot change others. That's something that all educators should understand very well. So don't even try. It is counterproductive. Just accompany them in their journey, generate the learning environment. That's all we have to do, really. I think that we should only use technology when it's really, really necessary, and for different reasons. But a learning environment, and this is very important to me, I believe that a learning environment should be a healing environment. We shouldn't stress a student. We should not police a student. Do not judge your students. Basically, accept that you have the students you have and love them as they are, because they are what they are, right? So you have the students you have and just love them as if they are your children. You have what you have. You cannot change that. So the moment you accept your students as they are, the learning environment changes significantly, and their performance changes significantly. So build a learning community. Again, this is very important. And generate a safe space to challenge yourself and to challenge your students, and be completely open and willing to learn with your students. We are all learning, right? We don't know what we don't know. And then finally, dealing together with uncomfortable realities. So first of all, thanks your students for learning with you. Really, I mean, they are there to learn as a group. Validate their emotions and share yours. There are scary things going on, right? So when they express fear of what is going on, don't minimize it. So just validate it and share your vulnerability, right? For example, meditation in the classroom generate a sense of community and also lower the level of anxiety and fear. And remember that fear triggers conservative thinking. So every tool you can give them to deal with that is also good. We are where we have to be, no matter what. We are where we have to be because we are where we are. So we have to understand this in a spiritual level, I think. For example, when the students told me, okay, what are we going to do with all these crises, this social and ecological crisis? It's almost impossible that we will solve all of them. And I told them, okay, but what will happen if we solve all the social and environmental crises tomorrow? What would happen? Exactly the same thing, that you are going to die, right? In 30, 40 years, 10. So really, no matter what we do, the same thing will happen. We are all going to die. So not the culture that fears death the most is the culture that destroys life the quickest. So I think overcoming fear of death is something pedagogical as well. I always play to my students the Shambhala warrior prophecy explained by Joanna Macy, which is very inspirational. And I told them that we are all Shambhala warrior at this point. Basically, we are in a moment in which nothing less is required from us, but changing completely a civilizational paradigm that has been globalized during the last centuries or maybe millennia, actually. So basically, it's an honor to be here together, right, at this sacred moment with this group of the students. And so just validating that we are in a sacred moment as every other moment. So I think that is important to understand that. So I think that's all I have.
Thank you so much. And I see Sharon has also joined us in the space. Hi, so good to see you. Okay, so I think, how are we all feeling? Good? Yeah? Okay. So I guess I'd like to open the floor for questions from the participants. I think we're all more interested in that than me continuing here. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, please raise your hands. And I think we're gonna be moving the other laptop around to have your questions for Sharon and Luis. Or not questions, comments, opening of thoughts, any kind. Yeah, we have one here. Yeah. We're just gonna bring the laptop so you can it's saved on Zoom.
Hi, hello. I just wanted to break the ice and just say thank you very, very much for both your presentations. I have learned so much. I'm not yet ready actually to ask the question because I'm still processing, which is, I feel like, yeah, just like tells you how valuable this was for me, because like some like thought processes or beliefs or like knowledge was like, you know, starting to be deconstructed and just, yeah, really challenged. And for me personally, this was like very, very, very valuable. And I wouldn't have gotten that from, I feel like the program I'm in right now. So thank you very, very much for that. Yeah. Right. Hi there. Sorry. Where did that come from?
Apologies.
Okay. Is everybody hearing everything okay now? Okay. So picking up on this idea of deconstructing the knowledge that we're brought up with, I wondered if I could not pit the two presenters against each other, but maybe start a discussion between you guys in terms of how do we, maybe from a more practical perspective, how do we consolidate the idea that we have to deconstruct these learned realities with what, Sharon, you were talking about, the cacophony of perspectives, where there is so much room in the media world that we live in for picking what knowledge you like. And of course, we in this room understand that there's a big difference between bringing a kind of, holistic, planet-centric, if you like, approach to deconstructing these economic learned realities. There's a difference between that and saying that the deep state is going to microchip us with the COVID vaccines. But somewhere there is a sort of link there that you don't want to accept what people are saying to you just because they're in authority.
that is not a very well phrased question, but hopefully you understand what my kind of thought processes are.
Please press the mic off.
Down there.
Yeah, perfect. So I guess now there shouldn't be echo anymore. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and address the questions, whichever.
So if I understood correctly, is this idea that now we are questioning everything, but at some level, that is what the some misinformation is claiming to do as well, right? Just don't believe anything, criticize everything, and I see this problem. Actually, I think now we have to be more nuanced than we used to be before, because now criticizing the mainstream now is very dangerous, because there is radical fundamentalisms criticizing also the mainstream. So if we criticize the mainstream, because for us they were already fundamentalists and extremists, but now this mainstream that is holding the system a little bit is coming into attack by other more extremists than they are, we are in a difficult position. That happens, for example, with the Environmental Protection Agency. I mean, we have been criticizing the Environmental Protection Agency forever, because we wanted more political ecology, right? More decolonial theory, more climate justice, environmental justice into it, right? But now, when the Environmental Protection Agency has been almost dismantled, right? We said no, it's better than nothing, right? So so now we have to be careful how we criticize. And I think it's that what I understood by your question. Is that so? But it's so. My answer would be that we have to be still more nuanced in how we criticize what we criticize. For example, when we said that we have to re-ruralize, right? We had a process of de-peasanization, right? Global, and we need to re-ruralize somehow. But when we talk about re-ruralization, we have to talk about depatriarchalization at the same time. We have to talk about decolonization at the same time, because a rural life that is patriarchal is not desirable socially, right? So we have to be more nuanced than we were. It put us in a much more difficult situation because of those things that were going on and are going on now. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with the point about nuance. There's the tendency to kind of reproduce this binaristic and also sort of dialectical thinking, like if one thing is bad, the other thing must be good, and there's no other possibility. So, you know, one decolonial strategy that has been kind of described by the modern decoloniality scholars is instead of dialectics, analectics, which is where you, instead of going into seesaw back and forth, you step back at least one step, maybe multiple steps, to see what created the sort of disagreement and tension that you're talking about. And then you see that there's actually more than two options if you can step back a bit. So this desire for, you know, either the state is amazing or the state is shit is, you know, very tempting. And it's also about, I think, context, when and how we're making the critique, but also it's really, really about discernment. And I think I only saw part of your talk, Luis, but this idea that it's not about content, it's not, here's the facts about, you know, this is why the state's bad, although that has a place, but rather supporting people to develop the capacities to make their own critically informed, contextually relevant, socially and ecologically responsible decisions. And that's, you know, I think that's what education and pedagogy can and should do, but it's not necessarily what we usually do. We usually do want to kind of insert these particular norms, but as I kind of say in my talk, it becomes sort of meaningless with the onslaught of information. So we have to prepare people to be able to be there sitting with what's real, and then say, this is where this is coming from, like this state proposition or this anti-state proposition, and this is where it's going. So what's the most responsible thing we can do in relation to these different possibilities. So again, there's no sort of easy answer to that, but having people have the patience and the sort of capacities to do that analectic work is something that very much orients the pedagogies that we work with as well.
Thank you so much. Any other? Yeah, we have one there. And thank you, Till, for being the transporter of the mic.
Okay, so thank you very much for your insightful presentations. I found quite important themes and the reflections from those presentations. And I have one question for Sharon and 3 other questions for Luis, but they will be some very deep details. I mean, they will be about some details. I will try to mostly open up some maybe discussions through these questions. So the Sharon questions is that at the beginning of the presentation, I saw that you were mentioning about the GTDF collective, and you were it was written that decolonial possibilities in some different areas, and one of them was philanthropy. And in that sense, I was not that much convinced that how can we decolonize the philanthropy, for example. I mean, I believe it is already a part of this coloniality and the global capitalism issues, and it could be also a concept that you mentioned, that heteroglossia. So this is a kind of my interpretation, but I wonder your interpretation in that sense. So coming to the questions for Luis, there was one book in the presentation you talked about, which was Why Greater Equality Makes Societies Stronger. And I haven't read this book actually, but I really wonder if you already did it. What is the configuration of the societies? I mean, are we going to think that the classical nation-state societies, or are we going to think some other configuration of the communities? So I am wondering about that one. And in the second questions, you also very much emphasized on the pedagogy of degrowth. And at this point, taking from the Sharon presentation, there could be a need of this thinking different layers. And in the concept of degrowth, we are already living in very unequal societies, and if we are going to implement some practices of degrowth, how different segments of the societies will be affected in this process, and how we need to imagine this process as well. And the last one is that at the end of your presentation, you gave us a kind of a to-do list as the summary of your theoretical presentation. And I wonder that how this to-do list was produced. Was it kind of a co-construction process, or was it something, your reflections on that one? So thank you.
Okay, I'll start so that Luis can get his 3 answers. It's a great question, and I think it's the work that we do isn't like the orientation isn't an investment in the fact that we could possibly decolonize philanthropy as kind of an end goal, but it's rather how can we use philanthropy as it exists toward decolonial ends. And there's also a need for different kinds of critiques. So I think it's important that there is a critique present and vocal that you can't decolonize philanthropy because of its roots. And it's also important to have people working with, like in the cracks of these institutions, to figure out how we can redistribute all the money that they have amassed through very harmful means. And you need sort of all of those present, because you need the people pushing really hard and saying, this is not right. Why does Elon Musk have $43 billion to buy Twitter? But then also someone, maybe not with Elon Musk, but with the philanthropic organizations we work with, which there's two of them in particular in the arts and in conservation, who we can work in different layers of the organization. So working with the board is one thing, of trying to move them, not probably to really understand the critique, but to understand that they can't ignore the critique. So for instance, in Canada, this question of settler colonialism and decolonization is basically difficult to ignore at this point. So even though the boards, who tend to be old white men, basically, don't necessarily agree with the critique, we can also help them see that they can't ignore the critique either. So they're not going to abolish themselves, probably, but it's important that there be a critique on the table, that needs to happen, so that they can move a little bit further and say, okay, well, we're not going to do that, but maybe we could redistribute these funds. And then you keep kind of pushing and looking for openings about what might be possible. But you need different kinds of people doing different things. We have a cartography of that, of different kinds of critique and the different uses of critique, in order to mobilize different possibilities and to mobilize resources. And redistribution of resources is not necessarily reparations. There's another cartography about that, but it can mitigate harm. And then once you have that possibility, then the other possibilities that seemed unimaginable before seem more possible.
Regarding the first question, the book, what was the title of the book? The Spirit Level, How Inequality Makes Societies Worse, or something like that. So they focus on the states in US. So they make analysis by states. They compare these different states and also some European countries. And what they found is that the more unequal, the more income inequality, the worse all social problems become, all kinds of social problems you can imagine, from mental illness to life expectancy to social mobility, you name it. Every social problem gets worse with income inequality, and the other way around. But also environmental issues are more difficult to solve the more income inequality there is. So they refer only to income inequality, which is only one kind of inequality. But was an analysis in what they call developed countries, which is not an appropriate name. But so the other thing is, the interesting thing about the book is that even for rich people, life expectancy got worse in unequal societies. Even if they had more money, their life were worse off. Their level of subjective level of happiness was worse. So it's very interesting, because even the people that we think they benefit the most from the system, they suffer the consequences of inequality as well. Of course, not in the same degree, but the second question about the degrowth. So when we talk about degrowth, is degrowth for the overgrowth people and regions, right? And there are within US, for example, which is overgrowth, there are some people and some regions that they don't have the resources they need. But the growth and degrowth, when we talk about degrowth, we don't claim that we want everybody to follow a degrowth universal model, because that would be, again, a colonial imperial impulse. What we think is that degrowth has to liberate ecological space so other regions can do whatever they want to do. They're pluriverse. We talk about pluriverse in this way, right? We don't need a model. We need different models. But what they specifically propose, the degrowth political economists, they have a list of policies that they will recommend. For example, cap maximum salaries, tax wealth, not capital, but not labor, but wealth, and distribute that for other environmental regeneration purposes, tax all kind of pollution activities, reduce working hours significantly. Then what else? Decide what to grow and what not to grow, because degrowth is not about degrowing everything. No, it's about thinking as a society, what things should grow and what things shouldn't grow. What is obvious is that things that are intensive, energy and material intensive, they cannot grow. They have to be kind of made in a more circular fashion. So the food system has to be completely different. So it's not that we will eat less, it's that we will change the food system. So we will eat food that is more nutritious, that is regenerate the soil, that and so on. And it's a different way of designing society as a whole, basically. And the last thing will be the pedagogy of degrowth is a work in progress. I am constantly changing some things do not work and I have to reimagine them. And they have been, of course, nothing is original here. It's like I had been in dialogue with the Latin American decolonial pedagogies, with the critical pedagogy, of course, and so on and so forth, with the degrowth movement. And so there are many things that I just borrow and put together in my classroom and see what happened, and from my students, of course. I mean, this is changing constantly because of my students. So it's responding to what works well and what doesn't work well, and that depends on the group I have in front of me. So there is nothing here is original at all. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? We do have one here. I like the idea of nothing is original. I don't remember who was it who was saying that thinking is like weaving, and often the threads that we weave with are not ours but other people's, and I really do love that metaphor. But yeah, go ahead.
Hey, thanks a lot. And just I wanted to really quickly reflect. I'm involved with the systems change, systems innovation field, and while regarding philanthropy, while it's still on the fringes, there are a lot of funders who are actually acknowledging that they cannot own outcomes, right? And that there is no direct cause relationship. And they are also more self-reflective in how they got to own what they own. So there is a movement there starting as well in those circles. Just very quickly, I wanted to say that as well. And my question, or more, I don't know, probably just more like a musing, is that very few people are lucky enough to think, to do that as their work, to think across regions, to think across sectors, industries, whatever you name it. And there are very few people who go to universities and engage with what you are talking about. So wouldn't it make sense to start all of this in preschool?
Do we have the mic muted on that one? Yeah, perfect. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I think so, yes. This should be so, but not just in the school system, because then if we think about Ivan Illich and the idea that the school system is problematic itself, right? So because it's reproducing the industrial work class and people that obey norms. But school systems, as we know them in the last few hundred years, they are also part of the problem themselves, even if they start early. But yes, I think I always say that if they will make me the Minister of Education and give me some power in that regard, what I will claim, try to put together is kind of permaculture should be taught in all public schools, because if you do permaculture, you know that you can design differently. You can design different societies. You can design different relations with humans and non-humans that are thriving for all, right? That are not necessarily competitive as we know the educational system that we have now. So I think so, yes, should be another level. But when I think, well, Sharon will tell you later, but when we talk about education, yes, we frame it as, or I frame it as university because it's where I am, right? But to me, education is much, much bigger. To me, education is a matter of design, sociological design. So education is not something that happens in the classroom. Education is something that happens in the way you relate to others, humans and non-humans. how you relate to yourself. And it's a way of socializing that has to change. So to me, even the education, the formal education, right, has limits that are established by the dominant way of thinking. So I think education should go way beyond that. And I think Sharon is much better than me in doing those things. So she can tell you more about that.
I don't know about that, but yes, there's a sort of distinction made in a lot of critical scholarship and education between education and schooling, right? And some of you might be familiar with that. So what we have mostly in Western mainstream institutions is a particular kind of schooling. And I think that usually people are talking about K through 12 when they talk about that, but I think it also transfers to the university. And absolutely, it should start earlier. And I think, kind of like Luis was saying, you kind of work where you are and you intervene where you can based on your kind of position. But we definitely work with teachers who are in schools trying to do this differently. And I think that's all very important work. We primarily work in the university because that's where we find ourselves. But yeah, absolutely, there's needs to be in all levels and not just institutionally, but also outside.
Thank you so much. Do we have one there? Yeah.
Okay. Many thanks for all of that. It's really a great field to take in, and you've obviously done a lot of really profound and good work on this. To revisit, and think I'll revisit it after this, certainly. But I wanted to ask, like you're just saying, outside the classroom. So a couple of questions, like within the work that you've been doing, or as you foresee doing, I mean, how much emphasis is there on, you know, that real experiences, encounters with transformative alternatives or movements, you know, in other words, outside the classroom in life, organizing encounters are part of the curriculum, which, you know, students are also encouraged to be creative about how they're assessed, let's say, you know, any range of ways of expressing. You said that about their, you know, reflecting on the experiences they have with people who are out there trying to change the world in radical ways. That's one. And then also, like in the curriculum, having courses or large parts of courses which actually study some of the more radical transformative experiences that are happening in the world right now, whether that's the Zapatistas or the Roosevelt or whoever, or indigenous peoples in depth, what their life is really constructed as and practiced as, you know, these kinds of things. So outside of, you know, texts and books and classrooms, what role do you see there for your pedagogy?
I can start, and I think
you have the mic muted there. Okay, can you start again? Yeah, thank you.
I think we in the collective, well, we have people in different places, right? And I think the indigenous communities we work with are, they're very suspicious of the university, but they also know that in many ways, the people who can do the most harm are the people in universities, because they tend to be the ones with the most power. And so I think they understand and want something to happen in that space, but not to stay in that space and not to be totally bounded by that space at the same time as we realize you're never really outside of it, even if you're critiquing it. So I think a lot of what we do is kind of, well, in the collective, the people who work in the university say we have a job and we have the work. And the job is my job as a professor, which is teaching, research, and service. And there are certain things I can do in that space to try and push and invite people toward different possibilities. And there are certain things I can't do, which is the work, and that is much bigger than the job. And usually we try to use the job to sort of redistribute time and resources toward these other possibilities. So for instance, and this is something I can also share with you all, I shared that cartography I was talking about with Saana, but we designed a course called Facing Human Wrongs that we got funding to kind of develop the course through the university and offer it at the university, but we also have it open access. So anyone can access it, and all the materials are free. We do ask for people, if they can, redistribute to donate to the communities that we work with. And then sometimes we run actual facilitated sessions as well, because we know that many people outside of the university are interested in this. Now, the one thing I also want to say is that this idea of learning from communities outside of the university, whether it's indigenous communities or activist communities or whatever, also takes a lot of calibrating, because there is a tendency, especially for people who are sort of disillusioned with the university or with mainstream schooling, to romanticize the other possibilities, which is not a very sober or sustainable thing to do, because when we romanticize, we project a lot onto the communities, and often our solidarity and engagement is premised on that romanticization. And when it inevitably breaks, because people are human and we have the good, the bad, the ugly within all of us, then that solidarity sometimes disappears. So there's that, plus the fact that those of us trained within Western schooling don't know how to hear these other ways of not just knowing, but being. So a lot of the work that we do is sort of trying to have people step back and see the patterns that they're kind of socialized into, so that there is a possibility of an exchange that is not just consumptive or extractive or projective. And that is actually quite a lot of work to learn from. And we kind of think, oh, if we just come and we listen to an elder, then we're going to be sort of enlightened. But in fact, that usually doesn't happen, and often kind of harmful things happen. So there's a lot of preparation work actually that we do with people who are going to engage, for instance, indigenous communities, so that they might be able to, you know, get a tiny fraction of what's being offered. And we work with the communities that we collaborate with to figure out how to do that translation, you know, in between the sort of what Western minds can hear and what they want to say. And we've kind of all come to understand that it's not just a simple sort of say what you want and people will hear. It's like, how do we prepare them to hear? It's quite a lot of work in and of itself.
Yeah, what we are trying to do is, as we tell the students, right, and we practice collaborative learning. So I try to do the same with my colleagues, not just in my university, but with my colleagues in the profession. So we try to do conferences otherwise, right? For example, rather than go and present panels and pretend that nobody has a body, right, and can be sitting down for 7 hours. So what we do is conferences in which we learn from each other beyond just this logocentric way of thinking, and we do like workshops in related to eco-pedagogy or to performance and in the classroom, how to use your body in the classroom, or things like that, that is more useful for everybody. And all the topics that we target are much more relevant than what usually is targeted in the usual academic conference and things like that. So we started Saana, an association that is doing this, and it's transformative for everybody, and it's very interesting. There is no hierarchy, so no matter who goes there, you don't have to be an academic. So that is, this year is going to be in Oviedo, in northern Spain, and we invite teachers, journalists, anybody that wants to join, and it's kind of a celebratory thing as well. It's very interesting. So it's just changing not just your classroom, but all the spaces in which your profession, but there is still a limit, because still we are in this kind of bubble, which is called academia, which is not going to last, and that is not really going to solve the problems. I don't think academia being part of the solution, really. I see there is a lot of rigidity. So anyways, what I think is how to incorporate this outside. What is the, as Sharon said before, like the preparing for the end of the war as we know it. So that means the end of academia as well. Academia is something very, very colonial, very, it's unsustainable in all, and probably we shouldn't sustain it anyways. Maybe it's not worth it to sustain, I don't know. But if we don't transform it significantly, it's not gonna be worth it to sustain, that I am sure. But what I am trying to do is what to do, and I'm still thinking. What I do is I train myself in permaculture the last few years very intensively, and I am trying to do a food forest in my neighborhood. So I have a food forest, and but that makes a community, which is my neighbors. First they think you are crazy because they see all these things coming out in your front yard. But then when you incorporate them into the picture and explain them and give them food and tell them how nice is this and why, then they start coming for advice, right? And they start, so you create a community. So to me, the academia is not going to be, I am almost certain, I don't know, it has to change a lot, but I think the academia is not going to be part of the solution. We have to start already transitioning. To me, using the academia, because it's a privilege to be having time to think, right? And so using that to think intensively of how we are going to transition. And that is, to me, the key. And I haven't figured it out, and so I'm working on it.
Thank you so much for all the questions and brilliant replies from you. I guess one of the, in a way, big themes that do arise from the conversation here is this idea of complexity and embracing the complexity and staying with trouble from Haraway, and that including both the kind of complexity of us in academia, us as either teachers or students or parts of a community, and then also the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with, which in a way also means seeing the brilliance and the amazingness of the world, but also the things that create anger and fear and hurt and pain. And in that way, that reminds me of kind of from gesturing towards decolonial futures. There's a poem or a piece of writing from Vanessa Andreotti and Dani D'Emilia, which one of the lines is that this work is palliative care for a dying dystopian world. And in that way, this educational work that we're doing is palliative care for a dying dystopian world. And that definitely will include being with hurt and being with trouble, but then also there's somehow beauty in it, or has to be beauty. And I guess that's something that was kind of nicely in both of your talks, which I feel were super inspiring. And I do realize that we're running out of time here, and the building that we're in is also closing at the same time that this event is ending. So I would love to continue the conversation and have more questions, but I would maybe open the floor for the final minutes for both Sharon and Luis to give maybe final remarks, thoughts, ponderings, and yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I go. So, yeah, thank you. This has been a privilege and an honor, and thank you so much for this opportunity. And just to mention about the Joanna Macy has something called the work that reconnects. Has been working a lot in how to deal with the pain. We have to recognize the pain of a dying planet, right? And how to deal with that in a way that do not paralyze you and keep you doing what we have to do to change this. And so this mix between hope, joy, and pain in a way that is generative, right, rather than paralyzing. And so Joanna Macy is very, very inspirational, and she has some practical ways to educate with that framework. So I would recommend that. But yes, I agree that we have to stay with the trouble. We have to, we cannot avoid the pain that is living in a dying planet, right? But also the honor that is being in this moment, in this sacred moment in which we have to really awake. Just to finish something about the Miamian from here, like the Miamian that they are now in Oklahoma. So their language was extinct. They don't like that word. They don't say it was extinct. They said was sleeping, and they awoke their language. Now they are native speakers of Miamian again. So this idea that the extinction itself is a very problematic discourse that can be appropriated to erase some realities that. So yeah, I think it's very important to understand that the things do not look well, but really if we all awake, things can happen very magically, because everything is sacred and things can change very fast. So
I kind of feel like I want to just let Luis have the last word because that was so lovely. But I'll just continue the theme, which is that we, the collective, have a saying. We have many sayings, but one of them is no shit, no starter. So if we don't start by facing the reality of how much harm we have caused and how harmed the planet and people are, then we can't move anywhere. So how do we develop the stamina and the disposition to be able to hold all of that and not just look for, sort of the naive hope or move into that desperate hopelessness of being immobilized, but rather walk that tightrope toward the possibility of a different future. But in order for us to get there, we have to compost all of the shit that we have been ignoring for centuries and that we keep adding to. So it's not maybe the most pleasant image, but I think actually becoming comfortable with that is really important so that we can keep moving with it and laugh about it, because it's hilariously ridiculous. And, it's not always fun, but we don't really have a choice, I think, if we want the possibility of a different future. And I know some people will choose not to do it, which is, at the end of the day, their choice. But for those who are called to it, welcome, and roll up your sleeves. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. This was really an honor to have you both here with us, and I'd love to continue conversations here in the hallways with you, but unfortunately we're a few miles away from each other. But I loved this opportunity to connect with you, and I hope that we do that in the future as well. And yeah, thanks for sharing your thoughts, and have a really good start of the day for both of you there. Yeah. Okay, I'm now gonna end the Zoom, and yeah, very anticlimactic. Thank you both.
thank you.
Bye bye.